everyone. Thanks everyone. Yeah, so it's me and my 40 slides now, right? That's between you and lunch. So I got the timer running. So let's see if we can make it. Yeah, first of all,
We have some system.
oh yeah. You can kind of throw me out of the room if I'm running over. That's totally fine. Yeah, first of all, thanks everyone. Thanks Stefan. Thank the whole Criterio team for setting that up. Right, I'm organizing conferences on my own, and I know how much pain it is. So give them a nice round of applause. Okay, so what I want to talk about is the open source firmware ecosystem, right? And I'm one of these people that worked last minute on the slides. So 12 hours ago, when I was working on these slides, I kind of noticed that I actually don't understand it, right? So it's just the ecosystem, right? So it's what it is. It's what we have right now, and we kind of have to work with it. But don't get the impression of that after that talk you know how it works, right? I'm working for 7 years, 8 years now in that ecosystem. Founded 2 companies on that and the nonprofit here, and I don't understand it, right? So it would be good if I can press that in 40 minutes, but I can't. So that was last year, PremDay. It was edition 0, I just learned. Um, and that's me and part of my team here. And Evan invited us there to come by and listen. And as Evan already said, I'm not an infra owner, right? I don't do on-prem deployments. I have no clue what you're actually dealing with on a day-by-day basis, right? So I got no idea about cooling, getting racks in and out of a data center. I barely see data centers at all, right? So I'm a firmware guy, and that's kind of my scope here. And we were at Scaleway last year, and they also have a Alliance Theater, right? It's a dark room, I think red chairs. It looks really like a cinema, right? And super cozy. That was great. And I started listening to the talks, and there were 5 talks and I think a panel discussion going on. And first talk, I think, was from Criterio or Scaleway, not sure about, but kind of firmware was kind of in there, right? I said, okay, that's interesting. I probably understand why I'm here now. Second talk, firmware comes up again. Third talk, firmware comes up again. It was like, I'm not smart, yeah, but there's a pattern here, right? And yeah, so firmware, seems to be an issue somehow, right? I heard it. I'm sorry. I'm part of the thing somehow, and dealing that you have to deal with all of that, right? I want to apologize, even though I didn't. It's not my fault, right? But I didn't fix it yet. So yeah, let's see. Um, Yesterday, same pattern, right? So it's still an issue. So I don't know if nothing changed or if it got worse or better. I have no idea. But the stuff that you're asking for is like bare minimum, right? It's like reliable BMCs, right? It's like please don't crash, right? It's like that would be good, right? Someone was asking for, can we have something that is kind of OpenBMC? It's fine if it's closed source, right? But if can we get something, right? Ideally, but if not, something, right? So I don't know. It's sad, right? It's sad to see that you have to deal with all of that, and I hope I can give you kind of an idea on why it is like that, maybe, or what it is like right now, and what can we do in the future to improve on that. So what is firmware? Yesterday someone said firmware is software, and that's exactly true. Firmware is the most privileged software that runs on your system, right? It can read everything, write everything. Nothing that you implement on top in terms of security is actually worth something if firmware is broken, right? So everything builds up on that. So, and this is kind of crucial to understand how important that stack actually is for every application that you're running on top. And it's amazing how overlooked firmware in general actually is. And when I talk about firmware, um, I I took one of these boards. I blanked out the vendor, right? So it was. I don't know if someone recognized that board. The vendor's in the room, right? It's it's made in Taiwan, but it doesn't say anything. So yeah. Anyways, so I most of my time I care about three stacks, right? They are kind of somewhere located here. And it's BMC firmware. It's host firmware, so what you used to call BIOS, now UFI or something else, and it's root of trust firmware. I know there's much more firmware on the board, right? If you're looking at one of these boards, there's probably like a hundred or maybe a little bit less of different stacks on there, right? So you have, I don't know, USB controllers. I heard hard drives are a huge issue, right? I wasn't aware of that. These are broken too, but yeah, I don't know, NICs, TPMs, whatever, right? You got like tons and tons of firmware. I mainly care about these three because that's kind of my field that I work in. But I know and understand that there are many more of that. So looking at the BMC firmware a little bit. BMC firmware is what runs obviously on the BMC. It's kind of the interaction point for you all, right? It's the thing that you actually talk to. Um, so you need it for maintenance, right? You needed to get all the metrics out of it, right? And what's the health status of the server, and whatnot. It has access to your infrastructure, right? It's kind of that gate kind of between your infrastructure and the outer world. And UI UX kind of matters, right? And I'm not talking about nice GUIs and these kind of things, right? I'm talking about APIs maybe, right? I'm talking about that it has to be usable for you. You're all DevOps guys. You can kind of code. Some of them, some of you maybe can kind of code. So you want to interface with these things. So user experience is actually something that matters here. Host firmware, you know, having a server without a host firmware, it's expensive brick, right? But it's your powerhouse, right? That's the actual work, right? So that needs to be functional. It enables the actual operation, right? Ideally, you can configure everything through the BMC. Boot times is probably something that matter, right? I mean, I've seen these things booting for 10, 15 minutes. I don't know why. Um, no one knows why. But that's an issue, right? So if you reboot the things for maintenance, you have to kind of get that capacity somewhere else, I imagine. So that's really something there. You need hardware support, all your PCI, whatever stuff that you put in these servers need to be supported. Ideally, you can debug a couple of things, and it should be simple. It's actually not. We will get to that point later, but it should be simple. Root of trust, it's something that's, I'm not sure how many of the servers that you have in your infrastructure already have root of trust chips on them. A couple, yeah, right? Yeah, okay, cool. A couple of those. It's root of trust is an interesting concept, right? So I don't know who's in firmware security a lot, but the general trend is that you try to push the problem somewhere else, right? So you don't want to deal with it, so someone else should take care of it. There was host firmware, right? And there was like this boot guard, and AMD has platform secure boot, I think it's called, that kind of secures the boot process, right? You kind of shifted that to the BMC, but the BMC had also secure boot and diffused keys there, but that was also not secure. So, someone else should deal with it. So, let's put another chip on it. And that's the root of trust chip. And it's actually there to provide security to your system. Yeah, your updates go through that, right? It verifies before you actually boot the system that everything is integer and everything's fine and authenticated and so on and so forth. It's the gatekeeper for ownership, and it will be the big gatekeeper for ownership in the future, right? So when you're thinking about root of trust, and it validates the firmware stacks, the other firmware stacks, that also means it prevents you from putting something else, which is intentional because that's security, right? But that also prohibits you from putting open source on that, for example. So you have to own the actual platform to be able to do that. So things like, you know, taking ownership comes into play there. You know, all the commission and decommission processes, I assume, right? Getting hardware into your data center, that's cool. I think someone from CERN yesterday said, you know, after, I don't know, X years, you kind of want to send it to universities, right? How do I get the stuff out of my data center, right? And not own it anymore, right? So that's kind of questions around there. So that's with the root of trust. So let's go a little bit into the actual status quo, right? As I said, it's what we have, right? BMCs are easy in that sense. I know probably people disagree with that maybe, but BMCs from a firmware point of view are easy in the sense of, I think we won the game there long term already, right? And the industry is kind of moving into OpenBMC direction, right? It's probably not OpenBMC directly, right? Everyone has their own gist of OpenBMC. Nearly every OEM out there tries out OpenBMC for sure, right? They have internal projects running on enabling a platform with OpenBMC. Can their team actually handle it and all these kind of things? The trend goes into OpenBMC. However, there's fragmentation in the landscape there, right? So as I said, not everything is OpenBMC, upstream OpenBMC, and that's actually what the customer want, right? The customer want the Linux Foundation OpenBMC upstream thing, right? That you can actually get, and not the vendor XYZ enhanced version of OpenBMC, right? And I was looking up upstream, right? Because that always confuses people. So I pull out the dictionary. No, I search on the internet, right? And wrote it down. And upstream means nearer to the source, right? You want the source. Yeah, you don't want the downstream something something. You actually want the real thing, right? And that's kind of important, I think, to state that this is what customer want. Host firmware. Actually, every SOC vendor, I think, on that thing there supports open source firmware. It works, right? So we are working with SOC vendors. It's all enabled, at least in the proof of concept state. Next generation, that will be production ready. So it's there. I don't know, right? That's all I can say. It's there, it works. However, OEM's barely adopting that model, right? So, and I think it has a couple of reasons. One of the reasons, and that we see changing right now, is really the platform enabling model, right? So how do platforms get enabled, right? And this kind of is true until now on how, in general, mainboards host firmware gets enabled, right? And it's heavily controlled by the SOC vendors, right? The SOC vendors have like a list of companies, IBVs, that get access to the reference code, right? And these IBVs take that reference code, build the product or not, right, and enable the OEMs and ODMs and you, essentially. And it's very, very controlled by the SOC vendors, right? They don't want to work with so many people, understandably, right? It costs support, right? They have to get more people on board to actually support all the other companies and so on and so forth. So this is kind of the status quo right now. If we're moving into an open source direction, right, and if we're moving into a direction that we want to enable the OEMs directly, we need to change the enablement model, right? We need to change that the SOC vendors do not enable only the IPVs, but the SOC vendors need to enable all the enablement partners, right? So everyone who's interested in actually bringing up their own platforms, that includes OEMs and ODMs, that includes the open source firmware communities, that includes, of course, still the IBVs. People still need support and maintenance, maybe on a production grade level. And everyone, right? So that means an OEM should be able to talk to a SOC vendor directly and gets the reference code from them and actually starts building their own firmware, host firmware, rather than going through the IBV. That's one thing that has to be changed, right? The other thing is talking about host firmware and open source host firmware, open, what does open mean? I mean, it's, it's kind of complicated. So even though if you run open source firmware in your infrastructure, more than half of it is still closed source, right? Open doesn't mean fully open, right? If you don't run any 15-year-old socks, then this is what it is, right? And that accounts for every sock vendor, right? It doesn't matter, how you put it. This kinds of is the truth for all of them, right? They kind of put their IP in the 55% here, and that's about it. And I don't see that changing any in the near-term future, right? So that's they still have stuff that, like memory training, for example, is something that SOC vendors are very, very strict about not disclosing, and a couple of other stuff that they actually do. They all have like a SPS, ME, PSP kind of stuff running before actually the host firmware comes out of reset, right? So there will always be stuff there that will be closed source, and that won't go away, right? It trends to get worse, right? But it's kind of a fight going on here, back and forth, but that won't go away. And we haven't talked about security at all, right? I mean, there's, if you're bored and if you wanna read something funny, right? There was a white paper from the UFI forum, and they kind of talk about why the 90-day embargo period is not enough for UFI firmware, because the supply chain is so complicated that 300 days sounds more reasonable, right? It's like, all right, instead of fixing the actual problem, fix the embargo, right? It's like, let's make the time just bigger. So you have to imagine what that means, right? Any issue, security issue that you have, any CVE that you have in your data center will stay there at least for a year, nearly a year, right? I told you, it's depressing, right? I mean, I don't understand it. No one does. That's what it is. I think I share the slides later, right? You can click on that link, get a tray of wine and try to consume that. Root of trusts, that's kind of the newest chips that are out there right now. It's still very early to give like good feedback on how does open source is progressing there, right? If they're actually enabling open source or not. There are a couple of open source solutions around that. The OCP has, I think it's under the Linux Foundation now, but they kind of started Calyptra, which is an integrated root of trust. So it will be a part of the root of trust chip, right? That does all the measurements and these kind of things. And that is, open source schematics, right? You can kind of download Verilog and this kind of stuff. It's open source firmware running on these things, so that's a good thing. A couple of vendors have like reference implementations on how you want to do it. As I said, right, there's like the potential vendor login, but it's still too early to talk about, is that always open source or not, or how's the trend actually going into that direction? It's just, there's not enough data yet to actually talk about that in that sense. A couple of projects, right, that you can use if you want to go open source, right? Maybe some OEMs want to take a picture of that if you want to look that up. Of course, we got OpenBMC, right? We got a couple of other BMC projects here. We got my favorite Coreboot project, but there's also EDK2 here. Linux boot is, something there. A couple of root of trust things here. Calyptra is what I just talked about, is that integrated root of trust part. There are reference implementation using Sapphire and the Microsoft Cerberus stack. I'm not sure if people are kind of familiar with that, but you can actually, from some vendors, you can get like a full reference implementation on the root of trust stack that kind of work with these three projects here. As I said, right, BMC firmware, I think the sentiment is looking strong there. We are really going into an open BMC direction, right? It's somewhere on the horizon there, but we're getting there. Host firmware, it's complicated, but partially it's there. As I said, next generation really, every OEM could do it, right? Because it's all production grade quality, root of trust. Still too early to talk about it. To summarize the status quo, right, on what we have right now, is host firmware platform enabling model needs to change in order to enable OEMs and ODMs better. Open doesn't mean open at all, right? We got a bunch of stuff in there that's still closed source, root of trust too early, and BMC leaning towards OpenBMC, but there's fragmentation in the ecosystem there. And that's a thing that I actually want to talk about, right? Being trapped. Being trapped sucks, right? I mean, that's kind of thing. So what's the trap? The trap are these pseudo, open source firmware solutions, right? These are these solutions that are kind of built on OpenBMC, but not really, right? These are these closed source solutions that had seen OpenBMC at some point in time, sometime, a long time ago. And these are like these value-added OpenBMC solutions. I think I saw OpenBMC Plus somewhere, which is like, okay. And I just still want to emphasize on the thing that Richard said yesterday, right? Value add versus, added pain or something like that. Yeah. And that's like exactly the direction that we're going with that. And I think, the whole idea is on that is let's try to monetize the BMC stack now in terms of, okay, if people want OpenBMC, let's try to, make our own version of it, add some pieces on top that is not publicly shared, and, charge for it, right? Try to monetize it. And what you're actually doing with that is when you really create your own version of OpenBMC and fork it and add something on top, is that you take away a lot of these advantages that open source actually has, right? I mean, why are the people using open source, right? I mean, why does Criterio has it as their, I don't know, printed on the wall, let's use open source. It's not because they are, just a fan of open source per se. They just like the whole, being able to debug it, right? Being able to contribute back to it, being able to fix your own bugs on your own timeline, right? So if you have any OpenSSL bug in there, which is kind of critical, right? And the BMC is kind of sitting on the internet more or less, you want to fix it on your own timeline and not when actually your vendor thinks he fixes this bug and then it kind of drips into your infrastructure, right? So you want to have control over that. And by doing these, pseudo open source solution, I think you're taking away a lot of these advantages on open source and crippling the actual solution here. Okay, so enough complaints. Whew, that was 25 minutes just complaining, right? I'm German, so I'd like to do that. That's
We are
like
French.
French also, yeah, perfect, yeah. So that's kind of in my DNA here. Moving forward, so what can we do, right? So talking to you, the customers here, tell us what you need, right? I had a conversation yesterday with someone, and he told me, OpenBMC is not feature parity on what we actually need, right? Tell me what you need, right? We need to understand on what you actually need to be able to put that in production, right? You have to understand that we are coming from a space, hyperscalers push that heavily right now, and they do a lot of these things on their own, right? You don't know what actually is running under, Google's and Meta's doors, right? So we as an open source community don't have like a clear understanding on what features do you actually need to have that running in production, right? And so we got hyperscalers, and of course the other part of firmware are these, Chromebooks or the people running the old X270, right? That don't want to want these people, spy on them. So you have to clearly let us understand what are your needs, right? Take calculated risks. I know it sounds dumb, right? But someone has to be the first one to kind of walk down that alley, right? I understand it's easier to follow, right? And that the other guys try it first, and if it works for them, it's cool. But someone has to be the first one, right? And I do see a lot of reservations sometimes on, I'm not sure if that's production works, and try things out, get your hands dirty, and try to work with that stuff, and of course get involved, right? The whole ecosystem needs engineers, and we need money, right? So we don't build an open source ecosystem from scratch, or we don't build it up with pure love for open source. That's part of it, right? And I understand that you all do open source work also, from the bottom of your heart kind of thing. So that is one part of it, but we also need money to run the whole show, right? It's what it is, and we need actually more of it, much more, right? So if you got some spare, we take it. A couple of words on the foundation, talking about money here, right? So we are a non-profit organization, and we have a couple of goals that we want to achieve, right? Drive specifications are one of them. In general, try to push open source firmware adoption forward. That's why I'm here today, for example. We try to provide guidance, right? So if you had any issues with upstreaming, how do I actually approach people? Who do I need to talk to, right? I know a couple of people in that area, so if you want to drop me an email on what's the best way to find X and Y, and whatever, I can probably point you to someone else who knows, right? So we do conference and hackathons and all this kind of stuff. We got a bunch of companies that support us already. We got a bunch of people that support us already. So that's all with no money, right? So it would be great if we can give out some money. And I got a couple of words for the actual vendors, OEMs in the room. So first, it's thank you, right? I know it's kind of hard to listen to people raging about the products that you build, right? And about the stacks that you have and so on and so. So it's I think it's a very nice concept of getting the vendors here and telling them what are our pain points, and what are we doing, and what can we actually do to solve them. So it's much appreciated to that you're actually here and that you listen, right? And you know what? They pay for it. Yeah, I mean, it's it's so smart, right? I have to admit that, right? It's like, let me put all my stuff on you, right? And you pay for it so that you actually listen to it. So I have to adopt that model, but yeah. Anyways, yeah, I think listen and learn is like one of the most key things here, right? A lot of people are being very vocal on what they actually want and need, right? When Richard was asking who wants LVFS, right? The room was like me, and I mean, you just have to listen, right? It's actually easy. And that conference is like the ideal sales playbook that you need, right? Just gather all the wishes, right? Build a product that's kind of in that direction, and people will buy your stuff. Work upstream first, please. Work upstream first. Don't build any, value add solution or whatever. Please, please, please work upstream first. And engage with us, engage with the customers here, engage with the communities, which is kind of into the direction of upstream first here. That would be much appreciated. Firmware is, evolving and changing all the time. Right? 5 years ago, having production grade host firmware wouldn't be something on server system. Wouldn't be something that we actually dared to dream, right? So and it's become reality now. And there are a couple of other things that are changing a lot right now. So stay ahead of the curve, right? Adapt all of that, and you will win the game long term. Thank you.
I will just take the first comment, I would say.
Sure.
Part also of the invitation for these guys on the open source firmware communities, it's also, I think, up to us, the infra owners, to raise a hand towards these communities. And I think it's kind of a goal also of the PremDay user group, is to be also reachable because I know sometimes it's difficult for some communities to find out or to reach out the people that are said to be interested.
Yep.
But it's difficult to find people which are actually ready to play or to try or to and so on. So and also another expectation for me for the user group is to set up the recommendation on the basic subset that would match all of us. To say with this set of feature, we're fine to make a try.
Yep.
So I think it's a call also for us to be more reachable and to more engage as a group to help these firmware communities to achieve a point where it's feasible and realistic to get this in production.
Yeah, that would be appreciated. It's even funnier if you stand here, actually.
I thought I was taller than that. Yeah. So I will come back with what I said yesterday as a vendor, Supermicro. When we made the first NVIDIA system, we had the goal to go to OpenBMC, and we couldn't because of NVIDIA secrets.
Yep.
Now, we have a process to enable OpenBMC on our systems. We have a lot of customers using OpenBMC. But that requires validation because we can't validate with OpenBMC at first. So we only do that with some, I would say, hyperscaler or big scaler because there is NRE, and that NRE, someone has to pay the test. And it's very hard for some system because when we validate a BMC, we validate that the BMC will actually report all the data from all the devices that are validated on the system, all the SSDs, all the AOCs, whatever we put on the system. They should report properly in the BMC and update properly the firmware with the BMC, because when you can't update the firmware, you come back to us and we come back to the previous slides. And the last thing is that to enable the customer, it's not only NRE. We only enable a customer if he proved that he's involved in the OpenBMC community, because we don't want to do the support on ourselves. So if you want to bring that up, that means that you have to, as you said, team up to come to us with a force. That is, we are a team. We are going for that line of product. For us, it's a motherboard. You choose a motherboard that everybody will use. And we find a way to enable that. But what we lived in the past years is being between the hammer and the nail. So people asking us to provide OpenBMC for their system and coming back to us because it didn't work. And of course, it's a caveat in the open source model. Someone has to pay this support. Either you do it yourself and you participate to the community, but if you want to rely on someone, you have to pay someone. And if you ask us to do that for free, that will not be possible. So the process is in place. We can, and I know all the vendors in the room are also working with OpenBMC, and they have a process to enable OpenBMC to the customer. Just ask and just find a way. That is not easy.
On the infra-owner perspective, we are kind of not asking for a product. We are kind of asking for enablement. You enable your systems into OpenBMC, and then we manage OpenBMC ourselves. As for the Linux kernel, you are not validating the Linux kernel. We manage this part. You are not installing our servers. Kind of, we are not asking vendors to install our BMCs. What we need is having an OpenBMC upstream, which is enabled for your platforms, and then we deal with all the rest, which all the distribution, signing, support, everything we do ourselves, except which is tied to the vendor, which is enabling the platform. And we want to shift the support line from a product perspective to just an enablement perspective, and then we manage the product ourselves. It's a big change.
Yeah, but the enablement is still quite hard to do. It's still a lot of work to do the enablement on our platform, to ensure that the warranty will be okay, that you will have no firmware update problem, that everything runs, that will fall in RMA, because your version of a BMC, your setup, the drive you put in there, they are not talking together properly, and you will come back to us, we say it doesn't work.
But we are not complaining when we are doing from the host. So we are already able from the host to do most of the firmware updates. So yeah, we are kind of trying to get the same model. We are not asking the vendors to support everything. We are just asking to the support of vendors the basic support of their product, and then we manage the rest.
So that's what we write in the MOE. So the master of understanding that we do with the customer, that to fix that, because you say you do not, but the history shows in our record that your colleagues are doing. So coming back to us to debug their problem.
Yeah, we have to do the line. I think
Yeah.
they have to be discussed, but
Exactly.
I
But
think
it's
there is
open.
other people that want to interact.
Yeah, I would say on that remark, we are already doing things that is not supported with your BMC, and we don't come to you for the support on that. And everything, and yeah, but it's we are already doing a lot of things around that, and I would say you are already doing the enablement for the platform for your BMC. So it's just pass that to us. We don't care about what you're going to do on that. Just pass the enablement, and that's it.
And upstream it, right? I mean, that would be a great benefit.
Yeah, this is a great topic. Thank you. When you saw your previous slide there, the Open Source Firmware Foundation, you had a few. Yeah, this one. This is really good. I see some highly profitable companies in the hyperscaler space. How close are you to kind of? I mean, what feedback do you get from them, say, to kind of, have a goodwill on the community and push to release more and kind of, help other OEMs and ODMs release more of their proprietary stuff? And how do you see that from your perspective, from the hyperscalers' perspective?
So hyperscaler switching to an upstream first model, right? So there are a couple of hyperscalers that had their own forks in the past, right? Meta, for example, had their own OpenBMC version that was like forked a couple of years ago, and they're switching to Linux Foundation OpenBMC now. There was a talk from Patrick Williams, who's working at Meta, who actually talked about that. And all the features that they're planning for future platforms, they're developing that in the open, right? So they're speccing it in the open, so writing the specs in the open, and developing the whole thing in the open, right? So, and sharing what they need for their future platforms with everyone else, more or less. So they, more and more of these hyperscalers are switching away from their own stuff, more staying closer to upstream.
Do you think they have any leverage to push, say, the proprietary part of the pie into the open source pie? Or
I mean, they have a lot of weight for sure. Yeah, we see more and more code actually coming into open source right now. How much there's still left, who knows, right? Yeah. But we see a trend moving forward then, and what we also see is that they are taking over that work from the OEMs or from the ODMs, right? That are actually designing and building the hardware, saying we do it on ourselves, right? Because that's faster and we want it properly, right? So, and with that, I think more and more of that, closed source proprietary code that is still there will get thinner and thinner, right? Because it's a maintenance burden for them, right, to carry that around, right? Rebasing, right, and these kind of things, it gets harder the more stuff that you have to carry around. So they want to get slim on that.
thank you.
Thank you. Great talk. Given that Intel has probably less than one person working on EDK2 now, would you say that there's more corporate sponsorship of Core Boot than there is EDK?
So I was told not to bash any vendors before.
Oh,
So
I
that
am
was
fine
kind of
doing that.
my
It's fine.
requirement to stay here. But no, I cannot speak for Intel, right? However, I'm a big fan of Core Boot in that sense. And we made last Global Summit, we made the announcement that we're actually, partnering up with Intel on the previous and on the future generations on supporting that in Core Boot, right? So that is happening, and that is not driven purely by Intel, but has like open source partners like us there that also support the service. EDK2, the community in that sense is difficult because it's very, very much corporate driven, and Coreboot has a more natural open source community, right? So it's inherently much more active than the EDK2's part. I think the licensing of Coreboot is an issue, right? It's GPL2 license, so that forces you to open source it if you actually buy it. EDK2 is, I don't know, BSD, MIT. It's like whatever license. So, not sure.
So my point was like, do you think that core boot is a less risky proposition than basing your new product on EDK2?
My personal thing, I think yes, but yeah,
Thank you.
but yeah.
That's easy.
Yeah, you said that the proportion of binary blobs in host firmware is growing. Uh, that's true for host firmware, but like we've seen quite recently, like closed source drivers come in the open because all of the proprietary code is moved into the firmware. So how far are we from like open firmware with 90% blobs in them?
I don't know, a decade, maybe two. Nowhere near, actually. So it's you have to understand on. Okay, first of all, is the thing on how you define host firmware, right? Is it what only runs on the x86? It what runs before the x86 actually starts, but still enables it, right? So it's kind of, you have to kind of make it a clear definition on that. And as you said, right, some stuff got actually moved into firmware and made closed source to get it to be able to open source it on the higher level. So it's nowhere close. That's what we have, right? And but it's better than nothing, right? So that's kind of my point here. Don't get too too don't let that kind of pull you down here, right? It's better than the other state, which is 100% close, right? So you can debug that stuff. You can find issues in the silicon. You can kind of point it to, okay, there's an issue in the silicon reference code, right, that I'm using. And you can kind of throw that at the SOC vendor saying, stuff is going wrong with your code, right? And then they can debug it. So it's for sure not ideal, right? But it's better than anything else.
Last question, then we will have to go to lunch.
May I know what is the current frequency and process on the security updates?
On what stack or what
And
do you
the
mean?
OpenBNC, the overall codes that, like how long will the security be detected, fixes, and when will the patches be pushed in current situation?
So on upstream OpenBMC, forever, right? I mean, that's the beauty of it. It's actually, so if something comes in, we just keep carrying it onward. If it's used on the platform, and I mean, the good thing about is OpenBMC, and that also accounts for Cobalt and probably EDK2 and these kind of things, they share a lot of code among all platforms, right? Of course, they are platform-specific code, right? And there's no fixed timeline on how long this is maintained, because security features, the people that are actually bringing in the platforms are also responsible for kind of maintaining them. But for the common part, the community takes care of that, and that as long as the community exists, that will be that.
Thank you, Christian.
Thanks everyone. Thanks everyone.
So we are going to get the lunch at the same